On today's episode, we have a show 6 months in the making as we attempt to answer one of the bass fishing world's toughest questions: what is the best rod under $99? Well, lucky for you, I've been testing 6 rods from 6 different brands, all under $99, to try and answer that very question, and today we have the results. All that and more on this episode of Tackle Talk.
Hello everybody, I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
This is the Tackle Talk Podcast, brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. World-class fishing gear, unmatched personal service. Now, here's your host, Andrew Hayes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Tackle Talk Podcast. As always, we are brought to you by the fine folks over at American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. And last week, you got to hear from the Vice President of ALF, Brian Dolney, as he really kind of opened the door and let us in on some of the things that are going on behind the scenes in the fishing industry right now, and may lead to some price increases very, very soon, some of which we have already seen in the past week since that episode came out. But you heard it last week. Brian's a great guy. Everybody at American Legacy Fishing is awesome. They are my favorite place to order tackle from, whether it's rods, reels, line, baits, or used gear. They have the internet's best selection of high-quality used fishing rods and reels. I'm looking at the page right now. They actually have a reel that I've been looking for a while, a Shimano Tranx 300. I've been looking for a new musky reel. I've always wanted a Tranx at $240. That might be something I pulled the trigger on here pretty soon. Also, I'm looking right here. They have a Daiwa Tatula SV in excellent condition for $149. A great deal there too. I'm scrolling down. There are a ton of great rods and reels available right now over on the American Legacy website. Go to the top and click used to see the full selection they have over there. And as always, whatever you're looking for, new, used, whatever brand, whatever rod, reel, whatever you need, you can use code TACKLETALK5. That's going to save you an extra 5% on almost everything on the website, including regularly priced and sale items. It's a stackable code just for you all for listening to Tackle Talk. That is code TACKLETALK5 over at www.americanlegacyfishing.com. Okay, folks, first thing up on the show today, we have some breaking news as of this past week, and that is that one of the true legends of the sport, Skeet Reese, has announced his plans to retire from professional bass fishing after the 2025 season. It's another sad day in fishing. For a long time, Skeet Reese was one of the most dominant tournament anglers the bass fishing world had ever seen. He's in the top 5 of all time for money winners, with well over $4 million in tournament winnings alone. He's your 2007 Bassmaster Elite Series Angler of the Year, your 2009 Bassmaster Classic champion, your 2021 Tackle Warehouse Pro Circuit winner at Lake Okeechobee, 2024 Bass Pro Tour Stage 6 winner, and about 8 or 9 other wins throughout his career at the pro levels. He was inducted into the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame this past year in 2024 and is one of the biggest names in product development and tackle sales in history. And we were lucky enough last year in 2024 to have Skeet Reese on to join us for an episode here at Tackle Talk, where he shared some great insights and history about his career, product development, including one of our personal favorites here on the show, the Berkley and Havoc Pit Boss. So a huge congratulations to Skeet on an incredible career, and it's not over yet, as there are still 3 events left this year on the Major League Fishing Bass Pro Tour for you to watch Skeet on before he retires at the end of the year. Okay, next up here, we just had some brand new results from the Bassmaster Elite Series. The 2025 Whataburger Bassmaster Elite at Lake Hartwell just wrapped up this past Sunday. That was over there April 24th through 27th in Anderson, South Carolina. Really quickly here, I'm going to go through this because we have a ton to get to today. But your top 10 in reverse order: 10th place, Jacob Porosnik. 9th went to Emil Wagner. 8th, Wesley Gore. 7th place, Easton Fothergill. 6th place, Randy Howell. 5th, Jay Shakurit. 4th went to Drew Cook. 3rd place, Luke Palmer. 2nd, Tucker Smith. And 1st place, Paul Marks. So the rookie, Paul Marks, out of Georgia, his first year on the Elite Series, he notches his first blue trophy in only his 4th Bassmaster Elite Series event ever. So huge congratulations with 68 pounds, 8 ounces. Paul Marks is your champion at Lake Hartwell. Okay, let's get right into this. I'm excited for this. I don't want to wait any longer. I don't want to have any more news or anything to go over. I want to get straight to today's episode because this is something that I'm very excited to share with you all. And it is our pretty hardcore, in-depth comparison of 6 of the most budget-friendly but still tournament-ready rods on the market today. And this all spurs from you, the listener, and the questions that we get almost daily about budget-friendly gear. It's something that I hear over and over again. I read every mailbag question, whether or not it makes it on the show. It's great food for thought. And when you guys send those in, one of the most common themes we get is budget-friendly gear. And it just goes to show we have a wide variety of anglers that listen to this show. Some are brand new to fishing. Some are just getting back into it. Some are savvy vets. Some are straight up bona fide tournament pros. And a lot are kind of somewhere in the middle. And we try to make episodes that cater to all of those variety of anglers. So we've reviewed $600 rods before here on the show, and today we are now going to review rods that are 1/6 of that price that almost any serious angler can afford. So what I've done is I've tried to give as sort of nerdy and sincere and as much of a true apples to apples comparison of these 6 rods as I can so that you have a better understanding of the pros and cons of each of these rods and which one might be the best fit for you. So first, these 6 rods that I am about to name, I made sure that I bought the closest identical copy of each rod that I could so that we could compare the same length and action as closely as possible. So I basically went out and bought the closest to a 7'3" medium heavy fast in that lineup that I could. So there are going to be some that vary by like an inch or so, but that's really about it. And some of them, I think there's one maybe that might technically be rated an extra fast, but they are all the most basic, versatile, 7'3"-ish, medium heavy, fast casting rods in these lineups so that we get a true, like I said, apples to apples comparison of these 6 rods. So your 6 rods today are going to be the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee. That's going to be the JLEE C72-6, and that is a 7'2" medium heavy fast. Next, we have the Fenwick Eagle, and the model number here is EGL B73 MH-FC. That is a 7'3" medium heavy fast. Next, number 3 here is the Daiwa Tatula XT. That's model number 731 MH-FB. That is also a 7'3" medium heavy fast. Next, we have the Dobyns Maverick 733C. That is also a 7'3" medium heavy fast. Our 5th rod here today is going to be the Shimano SLX, the SLX CX72 MHA. That is a 7'2" medium heavy, technically an extra fast. And then our last of the rods here that we're going to review today is the Arc Cobb. So the model number here is BB73MH FC, and that is also a 7'3" medium heavy fast. So those are your 6 rods that we are comparing today: the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee, the Fenwick Eagle, the Daiwa Tatula XT, the Dobyns Maverick, the Shimano SLX, and the Arc Cobb. And I guess I should also mention here that I've been using these rods for probably about 6 months now, which means 2 things. One is good, and one I would say is probably bad. The good is that this isn't a flash in the pan review. These are some rods that I put in some serious time with. But number 2, the bad, is that when I bought these rods to do this episode like 6 months ago, they were all, as of that time, $99, and they were all available. Now, because of what we talked about last week, some of that is starting to change a little bit, and you're starting to see prices be raised a little bit on a lot of these rods, especially, like I said, all these rods are made overseas, so tariffs and things are hitting currently at the moment. I can't guarantee you that by the time you listen to this episode, all of these rods will still be $99. I mean, one of them I know already for sure. The Dobyns Maverick now has an MSRP of $119.99. You can still find it for $99 if you look hard enough on the internet, but most places now have it marked up to the $119.99 that GSM and Dobyns have directed dealers to do. So that sucks, but you're just going to keep continuing to see that in the coming weeks and months. Prices are going to rise. So what we said last week still holds true. If you like something, I would probably buy it now. But the good news is that the others, the Fenwick Eagle, the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee, the Shimano SLX, the Arc Cobb, the Daiwa Tatula XT, all of those currently, I believe, are still holding strong at $99 at the moment. But again, like I said, that could change any day. But today we are going to break these 6 rods down and hopefully answer that age-old question: what is the best $99 casting rod on the market? Or at least, I guess in this case, which was our favorite. So I went about evaluating these rods, I would say, in 2 different ways. One was on a purely kind of factual, statistical, maybe even slightly nerdy, actual apples to apples experiments to test them. And the other was to flat out go out and fish them in multiple situations to find out what I liked and what I didn't like about each of these rods. And I think it makes sense today to start with what I would probably call the facts here. So I know you guys can read the stats the company gives you on these. That's all fine and dandy. But we actually took the time to check those stats and compare them ourselves to do our own kind of quality control and tests here. So first was an easy one: the actual weight of these rods. Which ones are lighter versus which ones are just flat out heavier rods in your hand. And that's important because usually the more expensive a rod gets, the better the materials get and the lighter it feels in your hand. It feels less clunky, it feels less heavy, but still with that same power and usually even more sensitivity. So for this part anyway, we actually broke out our ultralight digital scale and weighed all 6 of these rods. And here were your results from our weigh-in here, and we're going to go from heaviest to lightest. So your heaviest rod of these 6 rods in our actual on the scale weigh-in is actually going to be the Fenwick Eagle. Surprisingly to me, the Eagle weighs in at 5.5 ounces. Now, yes, some of these rods are like an inch longer than others. So we have, I think, 4 that are 7.3 and 2 that are 7.2. So I guess that might have a little to do with it, but still, there are 4 rods that are at our longest length, 7.3, and the Fenwick Eagle is one of those, and far and away the heaviest. So that was interesting to me. Next up, our second heaviest rod is the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee, weighing in at 5 ounces on the dot on the scale. Next, the third heaviest on our list of 6, so kind of right in the middle of the pack, was the Shimano SLX, just barely beating it out at 4.9 ounces. And then right below that, again, we're talking 0.1 ounces for these last 3 rods here, was the Dobyns Maverick, weighing in at 4.8 ounces. So 0.1 ounce lighter than the SLX, which was 0.1 ounce lighter than the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod. And then your last 2 here. So the second lightest went to the Arc Cobb, weighing in at 4.4 ounces. And then your lightest rod of the bunch, coming in at still a 7'3" rod, so one of our 4 longest rods, was the Daiwa Tatula XT, weighing in at 4.3 ounces. So the range of these rods went from 5.5 ounces on the heaviest rod, which was the Fenwick Eagle, to the 4.3 ounce Daiwa Tatula XT. So even though a 1.2 ounce difference may not sound like a lot, that's a 22% difference in weight from our lightest rod to our heaviest rod. And in your hand, that does make a big difference. So there are your weights. Now let's move on to, I guess, more of an odd thing that I measured, but it makes a difference to me, maybe not to everybody, but I pay attention to things like this, and it's the number of rod eyelets and then the rod eyelet sizes. So the rod guides and the eyelets on a few of these rods are pretty different from rod to rod. So most of the rods had 9 guides total, and those rods would be the Arc Cobb, the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee, the Daiwa Tatula XT, and the Fenwick Eagle. But there were 2 rods out of these 6 that had an extra eyelet, giving them 10 total, and those would be your Dobyns Maverick and your Shimano SLX. Now, that's not a giant deal, but an interesting note. You get 1 more guide on the Dobyns Maverick and the Shimano SLX. But what I was more concerned about was the actual diameter or size of those eyelets. One thing I am not a big fan of is micro guides. So I typically like larger guide eyelet diameter diameters. That's just me. I like a normal sized eyelet. Line comes through it better. Leader knots come through it better. I'm just not a small guide guy. So I actually measured two things on each of these rods. I measured the diameter of the eyelet closest to the reel. So your biggest eyelet, the eyelet that starts everything off, to give you an idea of the overall size of the majority of those eyelets. Is it pretty wide open, or do the guides kind of choke that line right out of the gate? And 5 out of these 6 rods were basically the same. They were within what I'm going to call my own margin of error, which is I'm going to call for these rods like 1/32 of an inch, which is a very, very small difference. So if it was within that, I basically called them the same. So most of these first guides were between 8 and 9/32 of an inch. So a very nice standard size guide, but one was not. One rod on this list had noticeably smaller starting guides, and then all the way down the remainder of the rod, it had the smallest guides by far, and that was the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod. So for me, personally, I'm not a huge fan of that, just straight out the gate, not what I would pick. The rest had fairly normal guides on them. And we saw a pretty similar pattern on the tips of these rods too. Did any of these rods have a smaller diameter tip guide than the other ones? Answer there was yes, one did, but ironically, it was not the Jordan Lee rod. The one rod out of these 6 rods where we measured and it had a smaller tip guide was the Arc Cobb, coming in at 3/32 of an inch. The rest of the rods hovered right around 4/32, so 1/8 basically, if you want to simplify it, for the diameter of that rod tip guide. So that was interesting to me. Again, I'm not a huge fan of choking or restricting that line right at the tip any more than necessary. That's going to get like a little minus here for me for the Arc Cobb. So to summarize there, most of the rods had fairly similar guides and everything there, except for a very few small differences. Like we said, the Dobyns Maverick and the Shimano SLX had one more guide than the other 4 rods. The Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod had smaller guides overall, and then the Arc Cobb had the smaller guide tip than the other 5. So those were your big differences from the guide trains on each of these rods. And then came probably my favorite experiment of the episode, and it was testing the action of all of these rods and comparing them to each other in a somewhat controlled way. So we all do the thing, right, where you pick up the rod at the expo or whatever at the store, and you just kind of push the rod tip down on the ground to take a look at how that rod bends. That's fine, but I wanted to do this in a little bit more of, I guess, an objective way versus that method is a little bit more subjective, right? You know, everybody's looking for something different. You're not really measuring anything. You're just kind of going off feel and vibes and, you know, the look test on that type of thing, where I wanted something a little bit more, I don't want to use the term scientific because this is by no means scientific, but a little bit more standardized. So what I really wanted to be able to do was to see the bend of all 6 of these rods together at the same time, kind of overlaid. So what I did is I went in my bedroom, I set up a rod tube holder on the ground with some weights around it so that it couldn't move, and I put the first rod in that rod tube standing straight up, and then I took the line that was on the reel attached to that rod and pulled it until the rod tip touched a certain line, and that gave that rod a nice full bend. And then at the same time, I had a stationary camera mounted on the other side of the room, pointed right at that rod and right at that wall, and I hit a little button on a remote that took a picture right at that instant. So that picture would serve as our picture for rod number 1. And then I repeated that process for the other 5 rods. And what you end up with are 6 pictures of the same bend of those rods from the exact same camera angle for each and every rod in this episode. So then I took those 6 photos and I stacked them on top of each other in my photo editing software and made each rod a different color. Then when you look at all those photos stacked on top of each other, voila, you have a true, easy to see comparison of how the actions of each and every one of these rods compared to the others. So it was really like looking at all 6 rods at once from the same angle and each of them highlighted in their own unique color. Really easy to read. I was really happy with how that turned out. If you want to see it, you can shoot me an Instagram message or an email at tackletalkpodcast@gmail.com or whatever, and I'll send you the photo. Obviously, I can't put it in an audio-only podcast. But if you want to see that actual graph of those rods and their actions, just shoot me a message. I'll be happy to send that photo to you. But again, what that let me do in a very simple way is see which of these rods were faster and which of these rods were slower in terms of their action. And the results were a little bit surprising. So I'm going to go in order of fastest action to slowest action. So your fastest rod of these 6, meaning the bend is higher toward the tip of the rod, meaning that rod loads up faster hook penetration, but again, a little less play, and there's some, downside to a rod being too fast too. Sometimes you want a little bit more moderate bend, but we're not getting into that today. I'm just here to give you the results. So your fastest rod of these 6 rods was the Shimano SLX. Now that shouldn't be too surprising because the Shimano SLX was the only rod in the lineup that did not come in a regular fast for the size and the type of rod that we were comparing today. It only came in an extra fast. So that checks out. The fastest rod of these rods is the only extra fast. That's good. Now, this is where things get a little bit more interesting because from here on out, all of these rods are labeled as standard fast action. And in the grand scheme of things, they're all in the same ballpark, I would say, but there are some subtle differences here. So your second fastest action when we're comparing these rods went to the Fenwick Eagle. Then, very closely behind that was the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod and the Dobyns Maverick. Those were your number 3 and number 4 fastest, respectively. So your SLX is number 1, Fenwick number 2, Abu Garcia Jordan Lee number 3, Dobyns Maverick number 4, and your number 5, meaning the second slowest or second most moderate rod, was actually the Daiwa Tatula XT, and then your slowest rod by a noticeable margin here was the Arc Cobb. So SLX was your fastest, obviously makes sense, labeled an extra fast. Your fastest of the fast action rods was the Fenwick Eagle, and your slowest action of the fast rods was the Arc Cobb. Okay, let's move on here. Now let's talk about the grips on each of these rods. So for handle material, the Fenwick Eagle was the only rod in these 6 that used cork handles, which you guys know I have a personal love for cork handles, so that gets points for me here, but it might be different for you. Then there were 4 rods that used some sort of foam or EVA handles. Those would be your Daiwa Tatula XT, your Shimano SLX, your Arc Cobb, and your Dobyns Maverick. And then there was one rod in here that had more of like a hard rubber wind grip style grip to it, which was the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod. So for me, my personal preference is cork, but that changes from angler to angler. And then as far as looks go here, you've got the Shimano SLX, which is a classy black and blue scheme. Same with the Dobyns Maverick. Both of those I would call okay looking rods. Then you have the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee, which is a really bright white looking rod, a little too flashy and off the wall for me, not my style. And then the Arc Cobb has a little bit of like a corny, cheap, almost like generic camo print on the foam handles, which I'm not really a fan of. And then you're left with the 2 rods in this 6 rod lineup that I would say look great. The 2 great looking rods here, I would say, are the Fenwick Eagle and the Daiwa Tatula XT. The Fenwick Eagle just looks like what I think a fishing rod should look like. All kind of matte black, cork handles, nothing fancy, nothing flashy, just a clean, classy looking rod. But then you have the Daiwa Tatula XT, which looks like a way more premium, slick, kind of sporty looking rod than you would normally see at a $99 price point. The Daiwa Tatula XT to me looks like a $200 rod on looks alone. I think it by far gets my vote for the nicest looking rod of these 6 here, followed very closely by the Fenwick Eagle. Then you've got the SLX and the Maverick, which I would call okay looking, and then the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee and the Arc Cobb rod, both of which I'm not really a fan of the looks. But here we go. This is the second part of what we're going to talk about here today. And this is what I think, anyway, is by far the most important portion of the evaluation process. And that is summarizing my thoughts on each of these rods from my on-the-water experience with them. And this is where winners and losers, in my opinion, are ultimately determined. So what I'm not going to do, though, is I'm not going to drag this out and go through every tiny little thing and really just try and fluff this piece up. I am going to try and keep this very, very concise with my overall thoughts and the differentiating factors of each of them. So this will be very clean, very concise, hopefully, but we are going to give you my overall thoughts on each of these rods from out on the water. So starting with the Abu Garcia, The Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod, I'm going to start off by saying that the rod itself, like the blank, not the components, not the grips, not anything like that, just the blank, is a nice rod. I was surprised with how much I actually liked the action of this rod and how it loads up on fish, but the darn shame on this rod comes with its components. The first one here is like a preference thing, I guess. The micro guides, I don't like them. I wish it had normal guides. That's my first easy complaint here, but my other much bigger complaint was the grips on the handle. It has those wind grip, like rubber style handle on it with the Jordan Lee logo textured into it, and it just doesn't feel good in your hand at all. The rubber is way too hard. There's too much of a design going on and not enough of a standard pattern to feel good when you actually grip it. And the worst part was when it's wet. And this obviously probably should be said. I took these rods out in the sun. I took them out in the pouring rain. I took them out in the hot and the cold. And this was by far my least favorite rod in the rain or when my hands were sweating, because I never felt like I got a good grip on this rod. When the rod is wet, this rod sucks. And it's a darn shame because the rod itself, like the actual, like I said, blank and, the kind of skeleton of this rod is a really good, tough as nails rod. But the grips really ruin the whole experience and the whole usability of this rod for me. Maybe that's a little harsh, but that's how I felt. I could not keep this rod gripped in my hand well when it was out pouring down rain. I was just frustrated beyond belief, and I actually put this rod down, walked all the way back to my truck, and got a different rod versus just sitting there and fishing it out. I was catching fish, but I would rather walk like 3/4 of a mile back to my truck and get a different rod than continue to fish with this rod. That's how little I enjoyed fishing this rod when my hands were wet. Okay, now let's move on to the Arc Cobb here. This rod, and I hate to say this because there are going to be a lot of Arc fans out there that are going to hate me for this, this was my least favorite rod of all 6 rods. And that's just the truth. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. But I'm also going to say this rod was not as bad as I thought it was going to be when I first picked it up. When I first held this rod and looked at it, compared to all the other rods in the 6-rod lineup, I really did not like this rod. Now, it was very light, light to the feel. It didn't weigh much, and we obviously saw that when we weighed in these rods, which is usually a good thing, but this rod felt like not a good light. This rod felt like a cheap light, I guess, if that makes sense. It just didn't feel light in a good way. And then, adding to the cheap feel of this rod, little stuff was noticeably off with this rod, like the badge label right at the reel seat, where it's usually covered up by your reel, right on that reel seat. That was like already falling off, and I'd only used it, I think, twice at this point. It ended up completely falling off. The foam handles were so thin and cheap that it really wasn't my favorite rod to hold either. Not nearly as bad as the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod, but still not my favorite grip. And then the action, it was just missing, I think, some cojones, for lack of a better term. The backbone just wasn't there for what I would want out of a 7'3" medium fast all around rod. Now, this wasn't anywhere near as bad as one of the other rods on this list in this department that we'll get to here in a little bit, but still, this was not a rod that I would want to be flipping or dragging or throwing a Texas rig on compared to some of these other options. It also didn't handle my leader knots as well when I threw like braid to a fluoro leader because of that small eyelet at the top, so I felt like I was feeling that knot catch a little bit more on this tip than most of the other rods in this comparison. But other than that, it was an okay moving bait rod, but even with heavier baits like a 1/2 ounce chatterbait or something, it definitely felt soft. So I would say overall, this rod just felt cheap to me, and it felt a little wimpier, I guess, than some of its competition in this comparison episode. So that's the Arc Cobb. Now let's keep this going in alphabetical order, and next up is the Daiwa Tatula XT. Now, this is a night and day different rod than the first 2 we just talked about, and I was pleasantly surprised with the Daiwa Tatula XT to the point that I started second guessing why I don't look Daiwa's way on other entry-level rods more more often. I think because of this rod, I will in the future. Now, this rod also felt like it was missing just a little bit of backbone that I would have liked to had here at, again, a 7'3" medium heavy fast action. It felt a tiny bit light and underpowered, but that's very nitpicky with this rod. Nowhere near as underpowered as 2 or 3 other rods on this list. But the good thing here is that it was light in the hand, it balanced well, it had a bit of a softer tip to it, and the components on this rod were out of this world for the price range. The guides were nicer, the reel seat was nicer, the screw knob on top of the reel seat was nicer. This was, again, we said it earlier, the most premium looking rod of the bunch, and I think on the water it backed it up, and I think this was one of the most premium feeling rods in the bunch in terms of the build and looks combined. Now, does that automatically give it the win here? No, I don't think it does. We'll get to that here in a little bit, but I feel very confident doing just about anything with this rod. It held up well to flipping, to dragging, to moving baits. I just wish it was a tad faster. But if you like an ever so slightly more moderate rod all around without going anywhere near a true moderate, this rod fits that bill. And I almost want to call this a moderate fast plus. It's faster than a moderate, but I think it's slightly slower than a true fast. So for a lot of people, I think this rod will be a really happy medium as we start to see more and more people prefer a slightly more moderate action. Overall, again, a very, very nice rod and probably my biggest surprise, at least to me, of these 6 rods here. Okay, 3 down, 3 to go. Next up will be the Dobyns Maverick. And I don't know how to go about comparing this rod because in terms of on-the-water use, this rod is just in a different class because of its lack of power. And that's obviously true Dobyns form here. Their casting rods are almost always running a size light, so this is definitely still in that camp. If you were wondering if the Maverick follows the pattern of all the other Dobyns rods, it does. This rod just straight up feels like a medium, not a medium heavy. It does not feel like the other 5 rods in this comparison. Even the Arc, that light, sort of mushier, underpowered feel, still doesn't get down to this sort of level. The Dobyns Maverick 733C, in my opinion, shouldn't even be in this conversation, even though it's listed as a medium heavy. This rod felt more like a topwater rod or a slightly longer, like deep diving jerkbait rod, something like that, than it did just an all-around rod. And then, similar to a couple of the others here, this rod just felt cheap to me. It felt like this rod was built to hit a specific price point, and that's it. It's amazing to me how much better the Dobyns Fury feels than this rod for only like $20 or $30 more. So I guess this would be like, I don't know, a serviceable topwater jerkbait square bill rod, but it's far too light and flimsy for my liking, especially at the medium heavy level, which we probably could have expected from Dobyns here, but I wanted again to compare apples to apples and medium heavies to medium heavies. Like I said, it also just felt cheaper. It doesn't really balance as well as I would have hoped coming from Dobyns. That's kind of Dobyns' calling card most of the time. This didn't feel the same as the balance on like, you know, a Fury or something like that. This again felt like it was a little bit more rushed and not quite as complete of a rod as I'm used to seeing from Dobyns. But then if you just picked up this rod with no comparison, you might think, you know, okay, whatever, $99. This kind of feels like a $99 rod. What would you expect? It's obviously not going to feel like a $200 Dobyns, but after picking up the other rods in this comparison and seeing what a $99 rod should feel like, this rod is not a rod that I would spend $99 on, and that's just me. And again, that comes from someone who generally likes Dobyns rods and owns a lot of Dobyns rods. I wouldn't say this is the worst rod on this list, but it certainly is nowhere near the best. Okay, and then there were 2, and these are probably, you know, they're in alphabetical order here, so it was just by chance, but these are pretty much your 2 heavy hitters in this comparison. So our 5th rod here to talk about how we felt kind of on the water and using this rod is the Fenwick Eagle. And I had really high hopes for this Eagle when I took it out on the water for the first time, and I'm happy to say that it delivered. This rod, I think, think has the most backbone and felt the most solid on a hook set out of any of these 6 rods in this comparison. And on a medium heavy, I'm going to be doing a lot of hook setting. I'm going to be giving them the beans on worms or creature baits or jigs or even light Carolina rigs. And this rod can hand out some legumes. Now, it's not the fastest action as we saw earlier, but it's pretty close. But from tip to handle, this rod felt the most solid under stress. And after using a lot of these rods that were lacking some backbone there, this rod was a really nice upgrade in that department. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not a broomstick and it shouldn't be. But because this is a little bit tad stiffer of a rod, I would say, compared to some of the other ones on this list, yes, you might lose a little bit of casting distance, casting some really light lures versus some of these more, flimsy whippy rods we've had in this comparison that can definitely whip and cast a light lure a little farther. I mean, I could probably cast a really light bait farther on the Arc Cobb or the Dobbins Maverick than I could on the Eagle, but I'm not buying this rod to throw 3/16 or 1/8 ounce, Ned heads around or something. I'm buying it to throw full-size Senkos on a 3/8 ounce bullet weight or flipping a 1/2 ounce jig around some light brush or trees or something like that. The rods that we're testing here aren't meant to be finesse rods, and they're also not meant to be whooping sticks either. They're kind of somewhere in the middle, that very versatile middle of the road rod. And this Eagle does that exceptionally well at this price point. You also get a great feeling rod in your hand. Again, the cork helps with that a little bit. Cork is usually a luxury that's kind of reserved for slightly more expensive rods, I feel like sometimes. I mean, there's a reason why most $99 rods that you see aren't going to have full cork handles. They're going to have foam or something like that. I like that Fenwick kind of bucked that trend a little bit and found a way to cram a cork handle into a $99 price point rod while also seemingly not really sacrificing the rod itself or the blank. I also liked this rod for, medium to kind of semi-heavy chatterbaits too, right? Throwing a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce chatterbait around, this rod handled that really well. It also handled a buzzbait really well. This was a rod that I think I probably had a little too high of expectations coming into it, and it delivered on all of those expectations. So kudos to the Fenwick Eagle, definitely one of the better rods in this comparison. Okay, and then we come to our final rod here, the Shimano SLX. And I think if we were taking bets and putting odds on which of these rods would be the favorite heading into this episode, I would think the SLX would probably be the overwhelming odds-on favorite to win this comparison. This is a very popular price point rod, usually at the top of people's lists when they're recommending a rod to stay under $100, and for good reason. And when I took this rod out, just like the Eagle, I was kind of afraid that I held this to too high of a standard, but it was extremely evident after I made my first couple casts, caught my first couple fish. There's a reason why this rod has become one of the standards at the $99 price point. So first, this rod is a little faster than the other rods on this list, and you could sort of feel that out on the water. For hook sets and bottom baits, it was great. I loved it. And it was surprisingly sensitive too for a $99 rod. I would say this is in your top 2 or 3 of all of the rods on this list in terms of pure sensitivity, with the Eagle and the Tatula probably being the other 2. But I found myself just wishing that it was a tad bit slower for throwing moving baits. So it basically comes down to this SLX probably being my favorite bottom bait rod out of the 6 that we tested in terms of sensitivity, backbone, action, but it was not my favorite when I broke out the double willow spinnerbait or a chatterbait or something like that. Now, the action wasn't my favorite, but the strength and the backbone of this rod were really good when I tied on something like a larger swim bait or a glide bait, because the one interesting, maybe plus, maybe minus, depending on how you look at it, is this is a pretty thick rod. This is a beefy rod, especially at that middle section. When you look at it, there is a noticeable difference between this rod and a lot of the other rods in this episode. So I did feel more comfortable, right or wrong, I don't know, maybe it was a confidence thing, throwing larger baits on this rod because of that. But on the other hand, this rod had a little bit heavier feel in your hand compared to some of these others because, again, it's just a little beefier looking of a rod. Even though on the scale it was right in the middle of the pack, it did feel a little bigger in your hands. Balance and just the overall look of the thickness of that rod probably had something to do with that. But this was easily in your top 3, probably top 2 of the rods on the water for feel, fishability, strength, comfort. I really did like this Shimano SLX. So those are your 6. Now comes the really fun part. We are going to take everything we've talked about so far: weight, grips, eyelets, aesthetics, feel, action, backbone, on the water experience, and try and simplify that into kind of a ranking 1 through 6. So your overall rankings of these rods, in my humble opinion, are going to be coming in at number 6, last place here, I'm going to put the Arc Cobb. This was the cheapest looking and the cheapest feeling rod out of the bunch. It was slightly underpowered, and I think pretty easily this rod out of the 6 would be the one that I was least likely to buy. So unfortunately, the Arc Cobb, better luck next time, I guess. Number 5 here on our list, it's kind of a surprise here, but it's really how I feel. 5th place is going to the Dobyns Maverick. And there were some obvious problems with this rod being severely underpowered and the lack of backbone that you kind of, again, come to expect when you buy a medium heavy from Dobyns, but it also just flat out didn't feel up to par with the top 4 rods on this list. A pretty big disappointment from Dobyns on this one. I think if you like Dobyns, it would be worth it to spend the extra money and get a Fury. Okay, number 4 here on our rankings is going to be the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod. And like we said earlier, this is a real shame because this rod could have been a really dark horse surprise if it weren't for those darn handles. The micro guides, whatever, take them or leave them. I know that's a preference thing. I don't really like them, but some people do. I get it, but the handles are bad. If your hands are sweaty or they're wet because, you know, you're out handling fish and you're on the water, it made this rod unpleasant to fish. The action and the feel of this rod were actually pretty good. It's a very strong rod. I feel like I could have beat the living tar out of this rod, but it's on the losing end of ergonomics for me, and unfortunately, that ultimately means comfort. Okay, let's get to our 3rd place rod, and from here, this actually gets really tough, but I think I'm going to give number 3 here to the Daiwa Tatula XT, and it is by a razor-thin margin, because this rod barely misses cracking our top 2. At number 3, this rod is still a major surprise for me. It was light. It looked like $1 million. It had very nice, high-quality components and fittings and fished really, really well. The only thing that I think keeps this rod from number 2 was that it's just missing a tiny bit of power, and it felt a tad bit more moderate than I wanted it to feel. But overall, a really nice rod. Definitely my biggest surprise of this entire episode. Really eye-opening to get to fish this rod, a rod that I guess, to be honest, I probably never really gave a chance, but I should have. This rod, in my opinion, is well worth the $99 price tag in my book. All right, now your top 2. This is where it separates the men from the boys here. I am going to give number 2, and I guess this is maybe a tad bit of an upset here, but I think 2nd place has to go to the Shimano SLX. This rod was definitely your number 1 seed coming into this episode. It's got the Shimano reputation. It's got the look and feel of a rod well worth $99 or more. It's pretty strong, but my only ding here on this rod is going to be the exact opposite of the Tatula, actually, and it's that this rod was just a tad too fast for me, which makes sense because it's labeled an extra fast because the SLX does not come in a 7.2 or a 7.3 medium heavy regular fast to my knowledge. It comes in a 7-foot medium heavy fast, but not a slightly longer 7.2 or 7.3. And I just felt like this rod was a great bottom contact bait rod, worming, jigs, dragging, flipping, but it wasn't my favorite moving bait rod out of all of these. It's just a little less versatile to me, again, compared to your winner here. And it goes without saying, would this be a great all-around rod for you to buy? Yes, it absolutely would. I'm being extremely nitpicky here because I have to be, because we have to choose a winner. But this rod can throw moving baits 100%. You will still catch a ton of fish on this rod. But when you're comparing 6 rods and make an episode here, I have to make some tough choices and find some even small distinctions between these 2 rods. And this is the one spot where I feel like this rod differentiates itself ever so slightly. So the number 2 rod goes to the Shimano SLX. And that means your winner today of our Tackle Talk $99 casting rod shootout goes to the Fenwick Eagle. And this is a decision that's going to come from a place of versatility and also overall quality and components and how well those 2 things go together. So for versatility, I think unlike the Tatula, which is just a little bit on the slower side, I felt like, and the SLX, which was obviously a little faster, the Fenwick is a nice middle ground around right there in the middle, a true fast action that I would want if I was buying a rod that can wear a lot of hats. And second is going to be the fit and finish of this rod, because there's no weird flashy stuff like on the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod that's all white. There's no weird, cheap looking camo grips like on the Arc Cobb. There's no bright blue accents down the rod like the SLX or the Maverick. It's just a nice, classy matte black look with a split grip cork handle on it, and I think that is what a casting rod, in my opinion, should look and feel like. And I don't just like cork because of the looks. Cork is nice because it's almost like a good pair of boots or something, right? I feel like the more you use a cork handle, it just gets better with age. Your dirt, your sweat, your time goes into that cork. It smooths it out a little bit. It darkens it up, and over time that cork just kind of starts to wear with your hand, and that's what I love. I don't seal it with any of that whatever it is, U40 or whatever it's called, sealer for, cork handles. I don't do any of that. All natural. I just want that rod to look and feel well loved. That's my favorite feel for a handle, is a well loved cork handle. And it also gives me a great grip on that rod without feeling cheap like an EVA foam handle does. And then finally, something we didn't even mention here because I wanted this to be more about the rods themselves, but with Fenwick, you get a limited lifetime warranty with this rod, where with the other top two rods out of our top three, the Shimano SLX and the Daiwa Tatula XT, those only have like a 1-year warranty. So bigger protection on your investment as well, should this rod ever have any sort of, manufacturer issues or defects there. So overall, those are my thoughts. I really think in the grand scheme of things, you can't go wrong with any of our top three choices. The Daiwa Tatula XT, the Shimano SLX, or the Fenwick Eagle. The Eagle barely squeaks out the win here for me, but by a razor-thin margin, and I think your final standings I feel pretty good about. First place, the Fenwick Eagle. Second place, Shimano SLX. Third place, Daiwa Tatula XT. Fourth is the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee. Fifth went to the Dobyns Maverick, and sixth to the Arc Cobb. So I hope that helps some of you out there that might be looking for a budget-friendly rod where you can check out these rods and feel a little bit better about your choice. And I just looked a few minutes ago over on American Legacy Fishing. They have that exact Fenwick Eagle in stock. That's the Fenwick Eagle Bass casting rod, bottom contact, 7'3", medium heavy. It's $99. So if you use our code TackleTalk5, it takes it down to $95. And then if you're an elite member, you get 10% back. So it's really like, I don't know what that would be, $85.50 or something like that. They've also got the exact same Shimano SLX and the exact same Daiwa Tatula XT that we reviewed on this episode too. The 7'2" medium heavy SLX, the 7'3" medium heavy Tatula XT, all the exact same price as the Eagle. And then they also have the Dobyns Maverick in stock that you can see, but when you go to look it up, it just happened, what I warned you about early in the episode and last week, that price has now gone up to $119.99, so $120. But they do have it in stock, same thing, you can use the codes, you can get some money off there. They do not have the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee or the Arc Cobb, but you can find those over at Tackle Warehouse or some other stores. I think, and I don't know this for sure, again, this is where this gets kind of weird because I've been using these rods for about 6 months now. I think it looks like the Jordan Lee and maybe even the Arc Cobb are starting to be phased out or discontinued, because I looked and you can still find the Abu Garcia Jordan Lee rod that I was using. I see it on Amazon, I see it some other places, but it's the white one. It's not the black combos, it's the all white rod, and those seem to be pretty hard to find at the moment. And then the same thing with the Arc Cobb. It looks a little tougher to find than it definitely was when I first bought this, and there's some on sale and some that have been out of stock for a long time. I have a feeling that both of these rods might either be going out or getting a facelift. I think the Arc Cobb might be getting a makeover. I think I saw something that a 2.0 is coming out here soon, which I guess would make sense. We didn't really like the Arc Cobb on this episode, so it might be due for a facelift. That might be a great rod when they come out with the 2.0. The Jordan Lee rod also had, some issues that we talked about on this episode. Looks like both of those anyway might be on their way out or getting a redesign. So that's good, I suppose. But either way, again, I hope this helped. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this. If you liked this episode, feel free to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, wherever you listen. If you can do us a favor, go over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen, and leave us a review. There's a little spot where you can mark, 1 through 5 stars and then leave a little comment. That helps us a ton. Again, cost you $0 and something you can do to kind of help the show. I appreciate it. You can go find us on Instagram and Facebook at Tackle Talk Podcast. Shoot us an email, tackletalkpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll see you right back here next Tuesday for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.
Thank you for listening to the Tackle Talk podcast. Tackle Talk is produced by Andrew Hayes. Copyright 2019. For more, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.